Exodus. I have a handout here. This is at least for me, this is really rich to see how the Old Testament, which on one hand, it seems like it can be so foreign and different from our relationship to God and the world in which we live and how faith works today, to be able to see that no, it doesn't. At the same time, being able to see how the message that God has for his people and how he saves, and then what he does in sanctification, and really the end for which God has chosen to redeem people is very clear, even in the Exodus. Just the big picture to take us from the very beginning of Exodus. We find Israel at the beginning of Exodus to be the descendants of Jacob, his 12 sons. We now know them as the 12 tribes, and they are in Egypt. And in the course of Exodus, God brings them out of Egypt. And then as we come to the very end of Exodus, he brings them to where he comes to dwell in the tabernacle in their midst. And so I'm going to read to you the conclusion of the book of Exodus. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of Yahweh filled the tabernacle. And Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had dwelt on it, and the glory of Yahweh filled the tabernacle. Now, through all their journeys, whenever the cloud was taken up from over the tabernacle, the sons would set out. But if the cloud was not taken up, then they did not set out until the day when it was taken up. For throughout all their journeys, the cloud of Yahweh was on the tabernacle by day, and there was fire by night in the sight of all the house of Israel. Now, this is what we actually begin to see as Israel is exited, or they have been brought out of Egypt, that God's presence will now come to dwell within the congregation of Israel, and there will be a visible manifestation of the presence of God among his people. And we will pick up the manifestation by day and the manifestation by night of God's presence with his people. But notice the concluding portion is that God's presence comes to dwell in the tabernacle, which is in the midst of his people. We can see here what some people would say is a theme, a motif, a kind of like a pattern to understand what God continues to reveal in greater detail that is accomplished in Jesus Christ. And that is what God does in redemption is he takes people who indeed are enslaved, and he brings them out of this kind of captivity to where they become God's purchased people so that they may dwell in God's presence forever. So if you're ever wondering how, like, big picture connections between what we read God doing in Israel and what we hear the apostles preaching to individuals, Jews and Gentiles, God is rescuing people according to his own covenant promises, so that they, by way of his own work in his Son, he makes them his. He owns them. He purchases them, like that Passover lamb, with the blood of his Son, so that they may come to dwell in the presence of God forever. In order for God to do that, he has to deal with their sin. And we saw that God, in that way, he's going to provide, memorializing the Passover, a day in which a sacrifice will be given so that sin can be forgiven by God, and he therefore, through atonement, can dwell with sinful people. But that is so that God will bring them, in one sense, as his redeemed people, who atones for their sin all the way to the very place where God will dwell among them. So if you're wondering what is the message of salvation in Jesus Christ, if you're wondering like what is God doing with my life, or you're wondering what would it like to be a Christian, you're able to see in one sense, in the same way God is working in Israel, God works in the life of an individual to bring them to repentance and faith in God's promise being kept, which is in Jesus Christ, so that by the blood of Christ, one is purchased as God's own person. God atones for your sin. You are therefore forgiven, and God brings you through this constant work in you and among you to be able to be outfitted, so to speak, so that he may dwell in your presence. If you don't know God through faith in Jesus Christ, you can know indeed the pattern that we see of the Exodus is the pattern that God would do in your life if you were to repent of your sin and believe in Christ. So we'll see that as we go through Exodus. Now, where we find ourselves is we finished chapter 13. I'm sorry, we finished the beginning of chapter 13, and we're going to take up the middle of chapter 13, because in chapter 13, we did see that the firstborn of Egypt were slain because the blood of the Passover lamb was not over their doorposts. We saw for Israel, however, God passed over the firstborn of Israel because the blood of that Passover lamb did cover their door. And in that way, we also learned that all of Israel has been purchased by God, so that all of Israel's firstborn, whether that be of a woman or of a beast, it was possessed by God. Therefore, they would have to redeem back from God all of their firstborn. That's also where the Levites come into existence. They become, in one sense, this firstborn who represents the firstborn, and therefore they serve in a different way God for Israel. We're going to take up verse 17 in chapter 13. And this is where we'll see how does God lead Israel through the Red Sea and then into the wilderness, bringing them to Sinai. So you may want to think geographically, and we're just going to take it paragraph by paragraph. We are going from how does God take Israel through the Red Sea to Sinai? That's what I hope to achieve in 40 minutes. Well, first, the Red Sea's crossing also pictures God's leadership, and we'll see this accentuated in Moses' song. But as we walk our way through how God delivers Israel through the Red Sea, the very end of chapter 13, now we're introduced to this pillar of cloud and fire. We read about the same pillar of the cloud by day, a pillar of fire by night that came to enter into the tabernacle at the end of Exodus. Well, this is its beginning. And so in verse 17, we see that God did not guide them by the way of the land of the Philistines, even though it was near. Meaning, if God were going to take them on the fast route, that would be the way that they would go. But rather, God said, lest the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. Hence, God turned the people to the way of the wilderness, to the Red Sea, and the sons of Israel went up in battle array from the land of Egypt. And Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for he had made the sons of Israel solemnly swear, saying, God will surely take care of you, and you shall bring up my bones from here with you. Then they set out from Succoth and camped in Etham on the edge of the wilderness. Yahweh was going before them in a pillar of cloud by day to guide them on the way, and in a pillar of fire by night to give them light, so that they might go by day and by night. He did not take away the pillar of cloud by day, nor the pillar of fire by night from before the people. So one we're able to see is, how does God lead his people? We were able to see that God leads them personally because he is present with them. God is personally present with Israel, leading them through the Red Sea. We are also able to see that how God leads his people is he leads them like a shepherd. Why does he not take them the fast way? Okay, we're going to see that there are going to be lessons, and we'll see that there's, in one sense, two kind of pillars or frames that will teach us these lessons. But Moses writes the reason that God didn't take them the short way. That's right. So he knows his people. And the way, I'm not a shepherd, never been one, only worked with other animals, but I am told that shepherds have to learn their sheep. And therefore, we see that God, in that sense, he knows what Israel is like. And he does not lead Israel the fast route to Canaan, but rather leads them along another route where they come to the Red Sea because he doesn't want them to engage with the Philistines immediately and thus flee and return to Egypt. But this is the reason that they go the route that they go. We will find that indeed this route is going to do two things. These are the two pillars that we'll learn about the lessons Jerry's talking about. Number one, we will see that God will show himself to be faithful and merciful and able to keep the promises that he makes to his people. Secondly, we will see that Israel is going to be commanded to trust and obey God's promises and commandments. So if you're wondering what is required for God to lead and for Israel to be led by God, these are going to be the constant lessons that come from the path that God will take his people. We do see that the leadership of God is visibly manifest in the day and by the night. And therefore, it is indeed God has kept his promise that he is with his people, just as he told Moses that he will be with him. We are able to see this. We'll hit a few different interesting things. That there's a lot more that can be said as it pertains to geography, trying to figure out exactly where that is by the way we think and understand this area today. But we read in verse 18 that they were led to by way of the wilderness to the Red Sea. Now, this is the way it is rendered to us. We're used to this Red Sea. The Hebrew Bible would use the word that means Reed Sea. But one thing we need to keep in mind is that the narrative, both in Exodus as well as elsewhere in Scripture, we find to be consistent with not a marshy sort of region that would be described by reeds, as in Israel somehow, like walked across a marsh, but rather we are able to see that indeed it is exactly as the narrative states, it is a sea. So don't interpret reed as some higher critics have done to refer to as a marshy area, but rather it is just it is the Hebrew rendering for this sea, but it is what we tend to think about when we say the Red Sea. We are also able to see that there's something that might seem strange to us. Moses, verse 19, Moses took the bones of Joseph with him. Right? That seems like, oh, well, that's interesting. And in one sense, it could very well be, what do the bones of Joseph indicate to Israel as they are moving towards Canaan? That indeed Joseph's faith was that he would not be laid to rest in Egypt, but rather into the land that was promised to his father Abraham. And in that sense, his bones are a testimony of his faith in the covenant promise made to Abraham that he would be given a land. However, I think what we are also able to understand that this is in fulfillment of what was promised to Joseph. Genesis 50, verses 24 through 25, that he would come to rest in the land of Canaan. And so we see even in these little details that God is keeping his promises to his people. Well, eventually God takes them to a place that is where we're not exactly sure on the exact location, but in a general fashion, it is coming to the place where today we have the modern Suez Canal. God guides Israel through this desert at all times, and they know that God is with them. They know that God is leading them because of the pillar of cloud by day, guiding them, and a pillar of fire by night, giving light, so that if God leads them day or night, they are able to follow God. We also see now, turning to chapter 14, that God has a route that is purposely confusing to Pharaoh. And so, but there's a reason that he wants to do this. Look at verse 3 of chapter 14. And Pharaoh will say, this is Yahweh speaking to Moses, Pharaoh will say of the sons of Israel, they are wandering in confusion in the land. The wilderness has shut them in. Thus I will harden Pharaoh's heart with strength, and he will pursue them. And I will be glorified through Pharaoh and all his army, so that the Egyptians will know that I am Yahweh. And they did so. The king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, and that the heart of Pharaoh and his servants was changed toward the people. And they said, what is this that we have done, that we have let Israel go from serving us? So he made his chariot ready, took his people with him, and he took 600 choice chariots and all the other chariots of Egypt with officers over all of them. Verse 8, and Yahweh hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, with strength, and he pursued the sons of Israel as the sons of Israel were going out with an exalted hand. So why did God also lead them in this particular route? Jude. What's Pharaoh's interpretation of what are they doing? What is Israel doing? Wandering where? All right. In one sense, he's now thinking militarily, this gives me a strategic opportunity to correct a mistake that I have made. Sometimes we do not know why God chooses the route and circumstances and paths that he does for us. And in that sense, Moses was revealed why, but it was so that Pharaoh would have his heart hardened and he would come after Israel with all of the chariots of Egypt. And so indeed, this is exactly what happens. We are able to see that God accomplishes his purpose not only to redeem his people, but also to judge his enemies. God has been very clear from the outset. He revealed this to Moses. You might remember from very early on, chapter 12, that Yahweh was on a public relations campaign among the nations. He was going to make Pharaoh know that Yahweh is God. And so this is going to be the concluding, public demonstration that the God of Israel, Yahweh, he alone is God. And so that includes the route that he took to Israel so that Pharaoh would harden his heart, change his mind, and bring his whole army of chariots to see if they could overcome Israel that they had just released. Now, Israel responds to this, and this is where we're able to ask a question. Israel has just experienced God keeping his promise that the death angel, the 10th plague, would come, and he, the death angel, would destroy all of the firstborn, except for those who have the blood of the Passover lamb over their doorpost. God has kept his promise. We also see how is Israel leaving Egypt? Are they empty-handed, or we'll just say fistful of dollars? They are rich. They have plundered Egypt in the Exodus, just as God said that they would. And so here we see God has made a promise. God has kept his promise. God has delivered them. God has redeemed them. Has Israel had a change of heart? Is there anything spiritually different in the disposition of Israel in relationship to Yahweh? And we're able to see in verse 10, as Pharaoh drew near, the sons of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them, and they became very afraid. So the sons of Israel cried out to Yahweh. Now we're waiting. What kind of cry might this be? A cry of confident faith, where they would offer petition to God to keep his promise? No, verse 11. Then they said to Moses, is it because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What is this that you have done against us in bringing us out of Egypt? Is this not the word that we spoke to you in Egypt, saying, leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than for us to die in the wilderness. What is that an expression of? We'll just give you two choices: faith or unbelief. Unbelief. All right, we do not yet see any change in the hearts of Israel. Now, this is going to be a chorus that we will be singing for the rest of the Torah. We will not only sing this through the first 5 books of the Old Testament, we will sing this through the whole Old Testament. But Israel responds with unbelief. And who do they direct their unbelief to? Moses. Now, Exodus, differing from Numbers, is going to focus upon the people of Israel. Numbers is going to give a little more attention to the leadership of the people in the Exodus. But we do see a little window into the good leadership of Moses in this moment. What does a good, faithful leader in God's house do when Israel expresses their lack of faith in God's promise? Does he say, that's okay, I understand, it is pretty frightening to look up there and see the greatest army in the world coming at you? And yes, there is a sea in front of us. It's understandable that you would cry out in unbelief to God. What is his approach? He actually rebukes them. He says, do not fear. Stand by and see the salvation of Yahweh, which he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you have seen today, you will never see them again. Yahweh will fight for you, and you will keep silent. Right? So in that sense, he just restates the promise of God to his people and the character of God. And in one sense, by this exhortation, is calling for them to actually have their faith rest in God and his promises to them. Now, this is not different than what do the apostles do when they write to the churches? They have to correct manifold things in the churches. And they don't sort of give excuses for, I understand that you're under persecution. Some of you have even died. Some of you have lost property. Right? Rather, they do exactly the same thing here, and they present what is indeed the truth of God's saving work in Jesus, the promises that have indeed come to them in Jesus, and they call them, trust them. Trust them. This is good leadership. It is good leadership in Israel, and it's good leadership in the church. And so we see that's how Moses responds at this particular moment when Israel is not believing God, which tends to be the default setting for Israel. God, however, God does deliver them, and we are able to see that he leads them to a place along the Red Sea or Reed Sea, such that later on in 1 Kings chapter 9, verse 26, we would read that this same sea was able to be the location for Solomon's fleet of ships. So if you can somehow harbor ships there, and then you can have the description of what then follows, we're not talking about marshland, right? You're talking about a sea. And here's what happens. Here's what happens is God leads them to this particular place. Again, we don't exactly know. I was helping my son Luke is giving a presentation tomorrow about the Exodus to his class. And I looked into a number of different resources to see. Not even the MacArthur Study Bible has an agreed upon, this is the routes. And so you can look, and there's various ways. So I chose mine. I don't know all the arguments. I'll let you talk to Tim about it, but I think it might be across the way from Marah, but ask Tim what he thinks later. But what we're able to see is as Israel is coming, Moses exhorts them to believe and not to fear. And now God, through his presence, God's presence literally comes between Israel and the Egyptian army. And God now, in this sense, is fighting for them. This is God's actual stated plan. Verse 18, then the Egyptians will know that I am Yahweh when I am glorified through Pharaoh, through his chariots and horsemen. Then the angel of God who had been going before the camp of Israel moved and went behind them, and the pillar of cloud moved from before them and stood behind them. So it came between the camp of Egypt and the camp of Israel, and there was the cloud along the darkness, yet it gave light at night. Thus the one did not come near the other all night. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and Yahweh swept the sea back by a strong east wind all night, and made the sea into the dry ground, so the waters were split. So the sons of Israel went through the midst of the sea on the dry land, and the waters were a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. Then the Egyptians pursued them, and all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen went in after them into the midst of the sea. Then at the morning watch, Yahweh looked down on the camp of the Egyptians through the pillar of fire and cloud, and brought the camp of the Egyptians into confusion. And he caused their chariot wheels to swerve, and he made them drive with difficulty. So the Egyptians said, let us flee from Israel, for Yahweh is fighting for them against the Egyptians. And Yahweh said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the sea, so that the waters may come back over the Egyptians, over their chariots and their horsemen. So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the sea returned to its normal state at daybreak, while the Egyptians were fleeing right into it. Then Yahweh overthrew the Egyptians in the midst of the sea. And the waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen, even Pharaoh's entire army. They had gone into the sea after them. Not even one of them remained. But the sons of Israel walked on dry land through the midst of the sea, and the waters were a wall to them on their right hand and on their left hand. Thus Yahweh saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians. And Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Then Israel saw the great hand which Yahweh had used against the Egyptians, and the people feared Yahweh, and they believed in Yahweh and in his servant Moses. So the events can be narrated as God literally creates confusion for a night so that Israel is able to pass through, supernaturally dividing the waters, drawing out the bottom. They are able to go through. Then God allows for Pharaoh's army to charge, thinking that it may remain the same for them. Then God commands Moses to move his hand so that the sea returns, and he drowns Pharaoh's army. Now, we've seen already water has what particular role in God's plan, or at least God's actions on the earth thus far? What's that, Peter? Judgment. So God used water to judge mankind in whose generation? Noah's. And then we also are now able to see that God uses water to be able to bring judgment against Pharaoh. Now, this in one sense is going to be something that we'll see throughout the Old Testament in particular. But we also are able to see how did Pharaoh, in one sense, start this fight with Israel? What did Pharaoh command to be done to all of the sons of Israel? I think I heard it. Jude? That's right. You can talk like real loud. All right. Everybody talk loud. All right. They threw him into the Nile River. So, in one sense, God returns the favor to Pharaoh. You thought that you would be able to thwart me and my people and my son Israel by throwing my sons into the river? I just killed your whole army by the waters of the Red Sea. So this is not an accident, I don't believe. Clearly, Moses teaches us that Yahweh overthrew the Egyptians in the midst of the sea, verse 27. And Israel was able to see, verse 30, that, verse 31, Yahweh's great hand that he had used against the Egyptians. And what was the result in the Egyptians, according to in the Israelites in verse 31? They feared Yahweh, they believed in Yahweh, and thus in his servant Moses. And that way we'll be able to see that when God acts and according to his promise, it is the right response of his people to believe in the God who does these saving acts for his people. It is also correct. These are not opposed, they are joined. It is right to fear the God who saves and the God who judges his enemies. And so those come together in Israel's response after they see Yahweh's strong hand to destroy Pharaoh and to save Israel. But you also able to see, and how is this fear and belief in Yahweh oriented towards the leader, Moses? They believe Moses. Now we'll see how long this lasts, but at least at the end of the Red Sea deliverance, that is what we are told, that Israel fears Yahweh, they believe in Yahweh and in his servant Moses. A song is a fitting response. And so in Exodus 15, we have what is called the Song of Moses. It's not that only Moses was singing, but Israel, the whole, was to sing the Song of Moses. The circumstances of the song are given to us in verse 1 as well as in verse 19. We read in verse 1, then Moses and the sons of Israel sang this song to Yahweh and said, and that we see that the circumstance, I will sing to Yahweh, for he is highly exalted. The horse and its rider he has hurled into the sea. We also are able to see in verse 19, for the horses of Pharaoh with his chariots and his horsemen went into the sea, and Yahweh brought back the waters of the sea on them, but the sons of Israel walked on dry land through the midst of the sea. So this is the circumstances that bookends the song. In one sense, we could say the song is a song of praise to God, who is the warrior who defeats his enemies and delivers his people. But what is maybe the most surprising aspect to this particular song is that it's prophecy. It's prophecy. So you'll probably pick up on this, being that we have been working our way through the Old Testament in this class. This song includes praise not only for God as the warrior delivering Israel from Egypt, but when we look at what is said in verses 13 through 16, we will see that this is speaking of what God does for Israel in the land of Canaan. In your loving kindness, you have guided the people. This is starting in verse 13. whom you have redeemed. In your strength, you have led them to your holy habitation. The peoples have heard, they tremble, anguish has seized the inhabitants of Philistia. Now, are they in Philistia? No, God purposely didn't take them that route. Now we're also able to see verse 15. Then the chiefs of Edom were dismayed, and the leaders of Moab, trembling, seizes them. All the inhabitants of Canaan have melted away. Terror and dread fall upon them. By the greatness of your arm, they are still as stone until your people pass over, O Yahweh, until the people pass over whom you have purchased. So here you're able to see, one, that Israel, in singing the song of Moses, they understand themselves to be the purchased or redeemed people of God, but they are also singing praises to God for, in one sense, this certain victory over the inhabitants of Canaan, thus taking the land of Canaan, which God promised to Abraham. Now, has any of that happened yet? We therefore conclude that in the same way that Abraham in Genesis chapter 12 was able to know that his descendants were going to go into slavery and be mistreated only for God to deliver them, we know that in the same way that Jacob was able to say about the tribe of Judah in Genesis 49 verse 10 that there would be one who would come from the tribe, Jacob said regarding the tribe of Judah that there'd be one who would be the king forever. 49 verse 10 of Genesis. How did they know that? God reveals it to them. It's prophecy. And here in the song of Moses, Moses is being revealed of God's future work of giving the land of Canaan to Israel. Another aspect that comes in is in verses 17. You will bring them and plant them in the mountain of your inheritance, the place, O Yahweh, which you have made for you to inhabit, the sanctuary, O Lord, which your hands have established. What's that referring to? Or at least what does it sound like it's referring to? All right, well, one, let's see. Is Sinai considered a sanctuary? Does God, in one sense, take up residence in Sinai? No. All right, yes. So and we're going to talk about Sinai, and that's really going to come up next week. Sinai is going to tower, in one sense, kind of like death between the Exodus and Canaan. Sinai, in that sense, and what happens at Sinai and what is given at Sinai is not going to be is not going to loom large over Israel's relationship and future like life and blessing. It's going to be like law that will seem to only threaten Israel making it from Egypt to Canaan. So we're going to see how this is going to develop. But here we're able to see that one, what is said is that this is a mountain. Two, it is a mountain of your inheritance. Then we are also say it is this is the LSB version, and they capitalize these pronouns. The place, O Yahweh, which you, that's capital Y-O-U, have made for you, capital Y-O-U, to inhabit. The sanctuary, O Lord, which your hands have established. Yahweh shall reign forever and ever. Is there a mountain where God will come to have a sanctuary and from which he will reign forever and ever? Zion, Jerusalem. right? This song of Moses is prophetically revealing that God's future plan for Israel is in no way limited to what is just going to be seen as exiting Egypt. It's not going to be fulfilled in the wilderness. It's not even going to be filled as they enter into Canaan and just in a literal sense take the land. It is rather that God here is prophetically revealing that they are celebrating God's deliverance with this future expectation that God is going to build a temple on a mountain, and there he will dwell amid his people and reign for eternity. Right here. Now, this is one of the reasons that you're able to see is the first 5 books of the Old Testament about the past? Are we just learning about Israel's history? No. This is a book of prophecy. It is telling us about the future. And so that's probably not what you would expect if you're just thinking that Moses and Israel stopped to sing a song of praise to God for their past deliverance from Egypt, but we're able to see it was indeed a song of praise for past deliverance and a song of praise for their future establishment when God would dwell in a temple on a mountain and reign forever. Well, that's the prophetic song of Moses. It's a real significant passage, and you can see it marked off because you had narrative, and then chapter 15, the first 18 verses. What kind of writing is that? What kind of literature do we call that? What? Did you say verse? Is that a synonym for poetry? All right, correct. If it's a synonym for poetry, you are right. All right, so anytime you have poetry that's in the middle of a narrative book in the Bible, that's like pay attention. And then likewise in poetry, when you have a narrative section, you also need to pay attention. And so it's incredibly significant, the Song of Moses. It's very similar to Psalm 78, if you want to go and read that. Well, chapter 15, starting in verse 22 through the end of chapter 16, we now wander with Israel in the wilderness. And this is also narrated for us in the book of Numbers. There are going to be differences between this, not because one is right and one is wrong, but rather because there's a different accent or aim in what this narrative is teaching and what the narrative of these events in Numbers are teaching. But as they enter into the wilderness of Shur, they've been freshly delivered. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10, they have also been baptized, and now they are going to be tested. There are 3 ways that God will test them, and it is just God's way. He's good. God will test them by how he gives to them. And we will see that the manna and the quail and the Sabbath, all good things, God will use these to test Israel. And here we will be able to see that this is going to show us something significant about how did law first come to Israel? What was its function? How was its burden, or what was its comparative burden? Which will then be contrasted later on when we see how the law in the Mosaic covenant is given to Israel and what is its burden and function. The first test is to trust God by keeping his promise, to trust God to keep his promise according to the covenant that he has made to their father Abraham when they lack water. So in verse 23, we see they come to a place that's called Marah, which can you remember when Naomi, she goes to Moab, she loses her husband and her 2 sons, and she changes her name, right? And her name sounds like this because it's both of them are related to the word for bitter. And so they come to a place that is called Marah. And that is because they couldn't drink the water there. Verse 23 tells us, for they were bitter. Therefore it was named Marah. Verse 24. So how do the people respond? They grumble. They grumble. Now, this is a direct rejection of God's promise in chapter 3, verse 12 of Exodus. So God has promised that he will bring them to the place that he calls them so that they may serve him. But yet when they arrive here and they do not find water that they are able to drink, they grumble at Moses, saying, what shall we drink? And then Moses cries out to Yahweh. Yahweh showed Moses a tree. He threw it into the waters, and the waters became sweet. And therefore there he set for them a statute and a judgment, and there he tested them. Right now, the play on words is going to be significant. Verse 26, here's the test. If you earnestly listen to the voice of Yahweh your God and do what is right in his sight and give ear to his commandments and keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on which I have put on the Egyptians, for I, Yahweh, am your healer. So at this point, what does God say Israel needs to do? All right, there's three verbs that are used here. If you will earnestly listen, that is to the voice of Yahweh your God. Secondly, if you do what's right in his sight, and give ear to his commandments and keep all his statutes. That's how they are going to go through the wilderness, and they will not suffer what God has done to the Egyptians. Now, what's the converse? If you do not listen, and you do not do what is right in God's sight, you do not give ear to his commandments and keep his statutes, then you will come to face those diseases. All right, there is the test. So in this way, how can Israel trust God and obey him? How can they walk with God with faith and obey him?
Individual people, or how do we look at that?
At this point, I think we have to look at it the way it is presented to us. Who is this?
Israel?
Yeah, and this is one of the emphasis in Exodus. Who is accented? Like, for example, look at verse 16. Chapter 16, verse 1. Then they set out from Elim, and all the congregation of the sons of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin. So I think it only is legitimate, Jerry, to say this is given to all the congregation of Israel. How does Israel, the congregation of Israel, how do they trust God and walk with him in the wilderness? This is a real question, not rhetorical. All right? So they need to listen. They need to listen to him because he's going to give them commandments. And they're going to need to keep them. So they're just going to have to, they're going to have to hear God's commandments, and they're going to trust them by obeying. All right, that's the test. Will they do that? So in this sense, is law in any way a response? We already see it, but is law a response to sin? What did they do at Marah? They grumbled. So now God meets them before they even enter into covenant at Sinai, and he tells them, let me tell you how, if you want to walk with me through the wilderness, you're going to need to listen to my words and keep my commandments. Now, this is pre-law. So this is the test. This is, in that sense, this is the paradigm for finding. If Israel's heart was right before God, we would then see Israel doing what God is testing them to do. They would listen to his words and they would keep his commandments. Which we can also say that about what did Jesus teach his disciples? If you love me, you will keep my commandments. And so here we move to chapter 16 and we see that this test is now going to take up the manna and the meat, or the manna and the quail. And so again, this is all the congregation of sons of Israel between Elim and Sinai on the 15th day of the second month after their departure from the land of Egypt. So this is before the third month. So this is, we're in month 2. We're in month 2. I think we're towards the end of month 2. Verse 2 tells us the whole congregation of the sons of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the sons of Israel said to them, would that we had died by the hand of Yahweh in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the pots of meat, when we ate bread to the full, for you have brought us out into this wilderness and put this whole assembly to death with hunger. Now, just so we can have reference points, does that sound like any individual that you have met thus far in your journey through the Torah? Who do the sons of Jacob sound like? Jacob I have loved, but Esau I have hated. Like, this is exactly what Esau did. Esau was looking at the promises that were given to him as the firstborn and rather said, what good is the promise if I'm going to die of hunger? And then, so they say, they're complaining, grumbling against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness, doubting God's promise, disobeying God's commandments. And so now Yahweh responds, verse 4, behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day. And here's verse 4, the last sentence, that I may test them, whether or not they will walk in my law. So what does the manna provide for Israel living, so to speak, before the face of God? Test. Now this is how the test works. Verse 5, now it will be on the 6th day they shall prepare what they bring in, and it will be twice as much as they gather daily. And so verse 6, Moses and Aaron said to all the sons of Israel, at evening you will know that Yahweh has brought you out of the land of Egypt, and in the morning you will see the glory of Yahweh, for he hears your grumblings against Yahweh, and what we are that you grumble against us. So that then happens, but then in verse 8 he adds meat. Numbers goes into more detail about this. But it quickly in verse 8 turns to, now Moses said, this will happen when Yahweh gives you meat to eat in the evening and bread to the full in the morning, for Yahweh hears your grumblings, which you grumble against him. And what are we? Your grumblings are not against us, but against Yahweh. And so here is what happens. Verse 12. At twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall be filled with bread, so that you shall know that I am Yahweh your God. Verse 13, so that it happened at evening that the quails came up and covered the camp, and in the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. Then the dew evaporated, and behold, the surface of the wilderness, there was fine flake-like thing, fine as the frost on the ground. And the sons of Israel saw it and said to one another, what is this? For they did not know what it was. And Moses said to them, it is the bread which Yahweh has given you to eat. This is what Yahweh has commanded. Gather of it every man as much as he should eat. You shall take an omer apiece according to the number of persons each of you has in his tent. And the sons of Israel did so. Some gathered much and some gathered little. Right? Tells us that they did it. So what do you think is going to happen? Do you think they will do what was required in the gathering of the manna and the quail? Right? Verse 20, but they did not listen to Moses, and some left part of it until morning, and it bred worms and became foul, and Moses was angry with them. The same is true for the quail, right? This is followed up with the Sabbath. The Sabbath, again, this is pre-Mosaic covenant, pre-Sinai. This is pre-law. And so now we see that God on the sixth day said that you're to gather twice as much bread, verse 22, 2 omers for each one. And this is because, verse 23, tomorrow is a Sabbath observant, a holy Sabbath to Yahweh. Bake what you will bake and boil what you will boil, and all that is in excess will be put aside to keep until morning. But did they obey? Verse 27. Now it happened on the seventh day that some of the people went out to gather, but they found none. Then Yahweh said to Moses, how long do you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws? See, Yahweh has given you the Sabbath, therefore he gives you bread for 2 days. On the sixth, remain every man in his place. Let no man go out of his place on the seventh day. So what did they now? They now had to give further restrictions, right? This test of the manna and the meat and the Sabbath is able to show, does Israel, do they trust the Lord? No. Now, repetition with variety is the key to learning. And so what God does for them, we see in verse 35. So the sons of Israel ate manna for 40 years until they came to the inhabited land. They ate the manna until they came to the border of the land of Canaan. Now, if you were to do the math, that is 6 days a week for 40 years. My math is that's 12,480 days Israel had to go through this test. And there we are able to see that the lesson that they did not learn in the very beginning, God continued to set before Israel, one, because he's keeping his promise and he's providing for them, and two, he is testing them and reminding them that they are to trust him and keep his commandments. This now turns to war and water in the desert. Again, before the third month, Israel commits another great sin. They become close to Sinai in chapter 17. They are in Rephidim. Again, this is very near Mount Sinai, and this becomes a place that is named Rebellion. That's what they actually named this location. The rebellion, Meribah. This is dealt with in Numbers chapter 20 with a different accent. Numbers accents Moses's failure at Meribah. Exodus is accenting the nation or the people. They're not yet a nation, but the people's failure. And here God provides water, again, because his people, they are needing water. Verse 1 of chapter 17, there was no water for the people to drink. Verse 2, so how do they respond? Therefore the people contended with Moses and said, give us water that we may drink. And Moses said to them, why do you contend with me? Why do you test Yahweh? But the people, verse 3, thirsted there for water, and they grumbled against Moses and said, why now have you brought us up from Egypt to put us and our children and our livestock to death with thirst? Now, do you see, like, it's the same thing over and over and over again? The pattern of Israel's response to God as he is leading them to Canaan is the clear indication of their hearts. Now, in the same way that we rightly make conclusions from the patterns of Israel, so we rightly make conclusions about ourselves, about our patterns of response to God. Right? In that sense, as you were just thinking, what is the work of God and his people through the way in which he's bringing forth fulfillment of his redemptive covenant promises? we don't need to think this is the end for which God has saved his people. This is not the end for which God has made redemptive promises that will be completed in the Messiah. What we're looking at is the ineffectiveness of what thus far has been achieved in Israel. And in that way, we rightly learn principles to say, when you look at one's life, you observe patterns, not a singular event, not an episode. You look at patterns. We will be learning from patterns in Israel, but I would just want all of us to learn the same thing about looking at our own life. The pattern of your life is the most accurate picture of what is going on in your heart. The pattern of how you respond to God is the most accurate picture of your heart's disposition toward God. And then here we were clearly able to see what is going on with Moses. And so God commands Moses to strike the rock at Horeb, verse 6, and from the rock will come water for the people to drink. And Moses did in the sight of the elders of Israel, and so he named the place Massah and Meribah because of the contending of the sons of Israel, because they tested Yahweh, saying, is Yahweh among us or not? This is a direct rejection of Exodus chapter 3, verse 12. Yahweh promised to be among them. Daniel, and then we're going to finish at 18 and conclude the class.
Their response, water. Like, what would have been the correct way to go? Should they have remained silent, or was it their tone in which they were asking for water?
When you say tone, I don't think it's because of like the way that the words were coming out of their mouth, such that if they could just say the words in a different way, then it would have been obedience. It would have been faith. It would have been trust. Rather, I think we can say probably the tone was an accurate reflection of their heart toward God. But in that way, if they would have been trusting God, believing God, then they would indeed recall or bring to mind what has God promised to do, and therefore they would have trusted God will be who he promises to be with us, and God will do what he has promised to do for us. And so I imagine they would give petitions. They would ask God to provide for them. But the sign in verse 12 that Yahweh gives to Moses to tell Israel, this is chapter 3, verse 12, certainly I will be with you. This shall be the sign that to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God at this mountain. So the fact that, what did they ask? Is Yahweh with us or among us or not? That is a doubt of God's promise of what he's already said to them through Moses. I will be with you. And in that sense, the promise extends till I bring you to the place where you will serve me. So I think in that sense, we would say they could have called out to God in faith, would you provide water for us? And
the problem was not there, they were asking. They were grumbling doubt.
Yes, their grumbling to God was a grumbling that did not believe the promise of God that he had given them. And in this case, through Moses. So he's clearly told them that I will be with you, I will deliver you, I will redeem you, and I will take you to the land where you will serve me. And so he's kept all these promises, but here repeatedly in the wilderness, when they talk about thirst and hunger, what do they hearken back to? Egypt. So they're not thinking like, well, I wish that I did not die believing in the wilderness, but I actually got to see Canaan. They're thinking, I would rather be a slave to Pharaoh in Egypt and eat than to be delivered by God and walk with him and trust him and even die of thirst in the wilderness. Like, they were not, those are not the same thing. Israel was not sort of saying that. Israel was saying, I would rather not be delivered by God. I would rather not worship God. I would not rather not trust God. I would rather not walk with God. I would rather die in Egypt, a slave to Pharaoh with a full stomach, than to walk with God, to know God, to serve him, namely to go to the place that he has promised to bring us in fulfillment of what he has promised to Abraham. Does that make sense? How these are, it's not fundamentally an issue of thirst and hunger. It's an issue of trust in God's promise. Does that make sense? That's a good question. I need to make sure that it's answered. Well, we then come to the end of chapter 17, and this is interesting, and I'll just say it as shortly as I can. This is a presentation of what happens after Israel defeats Amalek, which is, you may remember, this is a descendant of Esau, of Edom. And it has already been said that God is going to wipe out the memory of Edom from the face of the earth. And here we meet one of his descendants, Amalek, and they come up against Israel at Rephidim. And here Moses has Joshua, first time we meet Joshua, to command the army of Israel and to fight against Amalek. And Moses, he petitions God in prayer throughout the battle. And it is while Joshua is leading Israel in battle against Amalek, Moses is praying such that as he's praying, and he prayed with his hands up, that as they tired, he would have to get Aaron and Hur to lift his hands. And so in this way, you're able to see how was victory on the battlefield achieved. Not by Moses' hands, just in case we were all right, but rather through the way in which God mercifully kept his promise through the leader, the servant that he had chosen to lead Israel out of Egypt, Moses. And so we're able to see in verse 12 that thus, when they were putting stones underneath him and supporting his hands, all right, they were steady until the sunset, and Joshua overwhelmed Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. Now, interesting, it will not be, this would be a crazy Bible trivia question. I would not be able to answer this if I weren't reading commentaries. But do you know in Scripture the last Amalekite who is slain? Haman and Esther. You can remember another Amalekite, all right, we'll meet more of them, but in one sense, the promise is that the Amalekites, the descendants of Edom, are going to be wiped out from the face of the earth. And so here, in one sense, you see, what was the first nation to war against Israel? The Amalekites. And so God has a vow to wipe them from the face of the earth. Well, right after the victory over the Amalekites, we then meet Jethro. Jethro, you remember, is he a Jew? Is he a descendant of Abraham? No, he's not. So that means he's a Gentile. But we also know what is Jethro? As a Midianite, he is also a what? He's a relative now. He's Moses's father-in-law, verse 1, but he's a priest. Do you remember Jethro is a Midianite priest? Now, do you remember Abraham after he went to battle? and he won the spoils and he's coming away from war, who does Abraham meet? Melchizedek. And what is Melchizedek? He is also a priest of the Most High God. And how does Abraham relate to Melchizedek? He honors him, gives them a tenth. Moses bows down at the feet of Jethro in this occasion. Moses also, in that sense, we find Jethro, the Midianite priest, he also worships. He worships Yahweh with Moses and Aaron offering burnt sacrifices to God, verse 12, and with all the elders of Israel. And in verse 10, he blesses Yahweh for the deliverance of Israel. And then to add to all of this, he then counsels Moses, the giver of the law, for how to practically execute application of the law to Israel in the last part of Exodus 18. So anyway, all that is just interesting, and it runs very parallel to Melchizedek and Abraham. And this is also, Abraham met Melchizedek just before Abraham enters into covenant with God. Chapter 18 is when Moses is now meeting Jethro, yes, his father-in-law, who's bringing his wife and his children to him. But this is also just prior to Moses meeting with God on Sinai and entering into covenant with God at Sinai. We clearly have here a pattern. And that is there is in the Old Testament a righteous Gentile. There is in the Old Testament a righteous Gentile. And we've seen that in Melchizedek, and we see that in Jethro. So as we come to the end of 18, we are able to see that God is now bringing Israel, as they have gone through the Red Sea, as they are in the wilderness, he is bringing them through the leadership of Moses to the place where they will now enter into covenant with God. And that's what we'll take up starting next week in chapter 19. I want to talk about the goal of the Exodus event, and so we don't lose the bigger picture. The goal of the Exodus event is to bring not only Israel to Canaan, but it is to bring God to dwell among the people that he has purchased. And so again, I'll just quote Stephen Dempster. The goal of the Exodus is the building of the Edenic sanctuary so that the Lord can dwell with his people, just as he once was Yahweh Elohim to the first human beings. I do think that we see developing for us that God's work in the Exodus is to bring Israel to that place and to build that tabernacle where God will dwell in the very midst of his people, that indeed begins to develop for us how is God going to return his people to a place like Eden where he dwells with them in perfect peace in a world that is like it was. I think this is going to help us to see, and it's very significant, how does the covenant in Sinai relate to that goal? How does the covenant that God makes with Israel at Sinai relate to that goal? So we'll see what we can learn next week. I thought it was going to be faster. I apologize if you have labored hard with me this afternoon. Thank you. Any questions? But feel free to leave and not have to listen to questions. Questions? You're dismissed.